Wake with me on Lindisfarne, in the grey half-light before dawn on the 8th of June, 793. The tide has not yet come in fully. Twice a day this island becomes a peninsula, a strip of wet sand connecting it to the Northumbrian mainland, and twice a day the sea reclaims it, cutting it off again, alone against the North Sea. There is no wall here, no garrison, no reason in 150 years of quiet devotion for anyone to have built one. This is a monastery, not a fortress, a community of monks who rise before light to pray, who copy scripture by candlelight, who have spent generations building a reputation as one of the holiest places in Britain. Out on the water, barely visible in the mist, are ships, low-fast, unfamiliar in their lines. No one on the island has ever seen vessels built quite like these before, and by the time anyone understands what they mean, it will already be too late to matter. What does it take to make an entire continent believe the world is ending? If you want the answer, told with the accuracy this morning, deserves rather than the legend it's become, subscribe now. There is more of exactly this waiting for you. To understand why what happened on this island mattered so much, you first need to understand what Lindisfarne actually was. Because it was not simply a wealthy target. It was in the truest sense available to 8th century Northumbria, sacred ground. The monastery was founded around the year 635, when an Irish monk named Aidan was sent from the island community of Iona to establish a new religious house on this tidal island off England's northeast coast. Over the century and a half that followed, Lindisfarne grew into one of the most important spiritual centres in Britain, a place of learning, of scripture, of relentless devotion, and above all, a place inseparably tied to the memory of one man, Cuthbert, perhaps the most beloved of all Anglo-Saxon saints, a monk and bishop whose reputation for holiness turned this island into a pilgrimage site that drew visitors from across the kingdom. It was here, in this community's scriptorium, that the Lindisfarne Gospels were created, one of the most extraordinary illuminated manuscripts to survive from early medieval Europe, golden pigment and devotion poured into every page. This is what you need to hold in your mind as those ships approach through the mist. This was not simply a rich monastery waiting to be robbed. In the words used at the time, this was, in a very real sense, the place where Christianity itself had taken root in this corner of Britain. What happened here would not just be an act of violence. It would be read by everyone who heard of it as an act of desecration. To understand how ships like these could even reach an island this remote with no warning at all, it helps to understand what was changing across the North Sea in the decades before this morning. Scandinavian shipbuilders had, by the late 8th century, refined a style of vessel, long, shallow-drafted, powered by both sail and oar, capable of crossing open water quickly, while still being light enough to land directly on a beach rather than requiring a harbour. This was not new technology invented specifically to raid Britain. It was a maritime culture already accustomed to long-distance trade and travel, now applying that same capability to a different purpose. Historians generally point to a combination of pressures at home, population growth straining available farmland, and a political culture that rewarded ambitious men who could bring back wealth and status from abroad, as the likely drivers behind this shift from trading voyages toward raiding ones. None of this was visible to the monks of Lindisfarne on the morning of the 8th of June. What they saw was simply ships where no ships should have been, moving faster and more purposefully than any vessel they recognized. The raiders came ashore in numbers historians generally place at around 100 men. Not an army, not a conquest force, a raiding party built for speed and plunder rather than occupation. And what they found waiting for them was exactly what a monastery on an unwalled tidal island had to offer. No defenders, no warning, and monks who had spent their entire lives preparing for the next world rather than for violence in this one. Picture the ordinary rhythm this morning was supposed to follow. Monks rising in darkness for the first prayers of the day. The slow work of the scriptorium beginning as light strengthened, quills prepared, pigments mixed, the patient, decades-long labor of copying and illuminating scripture that had produced the Lindisfarne Gospels continuing exactly as it had the day before, and the day before that, stretching back for generations. There was no reason to expect this day to be different. That is precisely what made it unstoppable once the ships were close enough to matter. A community with no drill for this, no walls to retreat behind, no warning system beyond whatever eyes happened to be looking toward the water at the right moment. We should tell you plainly and without embellishment what the sources describe, because this is not a moment that benefits from dramatic exaggeration. The truth is stark enough on its own. Monks who did not flee were killed where they stood. Others, the young among them, were taken captive, marched or carried to the waiting ships, bound for a life of slavery in lands they had never seen. The church itself was looted, its silver, its sacred vessels, whatever, could be carried away and sold or melted down elsewhere. Then, as quickly as they had come, the raiders withdrew, back across water that had, until that morning, felt like protection rather than exposure. If you find yourself wondering how a moment this brief could reshape how an entire continent understood itself, our members get the deeper context behind exactly that kind of question. The connective tissue between one morning's violence and centuries of consequence, first and in full. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. News of what happened at Lindisfarne did not stay in Northumbria. It reached, remarkably quickly for the period, a Northumbrian-born scholar named Alcuin, who was living at the court of Charlemagne on the European continent, one of the most learned men of his age. Alcuin wrote letters, several of them, addressed to Bishop Higbald, who oversaw Lindisfarne, and to Ethelred, King of Northumbria, and those letters survive today as our clearest window into how contemporaries actually understood what had happened. To King Ethelred, Alcuin wrote words that have echoed across 12 centuries. It is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Read that carefully, because it tells you something important. Alcuin is not simply mourning the dead or the stolen silver. He is describing a rupture in how safe an entire people believed themselves to be, 3.5 centuries of settled life, and then, in a single morning, the conviction that the sea itself could no longer be trusted as a boundary. To Bishop Higbald, his words carried a different kind of grief, more personal, more theological. He described pagans desecrating the sanctuaries of God, pouring out the blood of saints around the altar, trampling on holy relics like dung in the street. And then he asked the question that must have haunted every monastery on Britain's coastline in the weeks that followed. What assurance is there for the churches of Britain if St Cuthbert, with so great a number of saints, defends not its own? If the holiest ground in Northumbria could not protect itself, what hope did anywhere else have? This is the moment worth sitting with, because it captures something the raiders themselves almost certainly did not intend, and likely did not even understand. They had not simply raided a monastery. They had, in the minds of everyone who heard the news, called into question whether the sacred itself still offered any protection at all. Consider, too, the distance this news had to travel to reach Alcuin at all. He was writing from Charlemagne's court on the European continent, hundreds of miles from Northumbria, at a time when news of any kind moved only as fast as a rider or a ship could carry it. That a raid on a remote tidal island off the English coast reached the ear of one of the most learned men in Europe quickly enough for him to write multiple detailed letters about it within the same year tells you something about how far this single morning's violence travelled, and how urgently the people who heard about it felt the need to respond. This was not a local tragedy that stayed local. It became almost immediately a continental event. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled by writers working in the years and decades after these events, records something else alongside the raid itself: omens. In the entry for this year, the Chronicle describes dreadful forewarnings over Northumbria before the attack, immense sheets of light rushing through the sky, whirlwinds, fiery dragons seen flying overhead, all of it followed shortly after by famine across the land. We should be honest about what this actually represents. This is not a record of a literal supernatural event. It is the language an early medieval Christian society reached for to make sense of catastrophe, the conviction that disaster of this magnitude could not simply happen without warning, that the world itself must have signaled what was coming. Whatever those writers actually witnessed in the sky that year, whether unusual weather, an aurora, or nothing more than memory reshaped by hindsight, the omens tell us far more about how deeply this event shook contemporary faith in the natural order than they tell us about actual events in the sky above Northumbria in 793. We should also correct something that gets repeated constantly in popular retellings of this story, because a channel built on accuracy cannot simply pass it along uncorrected. Lindisfarne was not, strictly speaking, the first Viking raid on Britain. 4 years earlier, in 789, 3 ships crewed by Scandinavian sailors landed at Portland on the southern coast of Wessex, in territory entirely separate from Northumbria. When a royal official named Beduherd rode out to meet them, following the standard procedure for identifying foreign merchants entering the kingdom, the sailors killed him. It was, by any reasonable definition, a Viking raid on English soil, and it happened years before anyone at Lindisfarne saw a single ship approaching. So why does Lindisfarne, and not Portland, mark the traditional beginning of the Viking Age in nearly every history of the period? Because scale of violence was never really the deciding factor in how this period got remembered. Lindisfarne became the symbolic starting point because of what it was, not merely what happened there. The first Viking attack specifically on a major Christian religious centre, striking at the sacred heart of a kingdom rather than a coastal administrative outpost. Portland killed one man. Lindisfarne, in the eyes of everyone who heard about it across Christian Europe, felt like an attack on the faith itself. History remembers the wound that changed how people understood their own safety, not necessarily the first cut. There is one more honest correction we owe you before we close this story, and it concerns the sources themselves. Every account we have of this raid, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Alcuin's letters, every contemporary description of what the raiders did and who they were, was written by the victim's own community, by Christian monks and scholars describing a pagan enemy in the starkest possible terms. This does not mean these accounts are false. The core facts, the killing, the captives, the looting, the shock, are well corroborated. But historians are right to note that accounts written entirely from one side, describing an enemy defined in religious terms as the ultimate outsider, carry an inherent risk of exaggeration in how that enemy's brutality gets described. We have no surviving account from the raiders themselves, no way to check Alcuin's grief-stricken letters against any Norse record of the same events. What we have is one side's truth, and we should hold it as exactly that, likely accurate in its broad strokes, and almost certainly shaped, at least in its details, by the trauma and theology of the people who survived to write it down. This is not a minor academic caveat. It shapes how we should read every phrase Alcuin wrote, every omen the Chronicle recorded. A description of pagan violence written by a devout Christian scholar mourning the desecration of holy ground is not the same thing as a neutral battlefield report, and treating it as one risks flattening a complicated moment into a simple story of civilized victims and barbaric aggressors, a story that has, admittedly, proven durable and popular for 12 centuries, precisely because it is simple. The real history sitting underneath that popular version is messier, more human, and, we would argue, more worth telling accurately. None of that diminishes what actually happened here. Monks did die. Children were taken from the only home they had ever known and sold into slavery in foreign lands. A community that had spent a century and a half building, something devoted entirely to peace, was shown, in the space of a single morning, exactly how little that devotion could protect it. The community did not simply rebuild and carry on as though nothing had changed either. Lindisfarne endured further threats and attacks in the decades that followed, and by the 830s, sources indicate the monks had already begun retreating inland to Norham for safety during periods of danger. In 875, after more than 80 years of living with the knowledge that the sea could bring raiders back at any time, the community made a decision that says more about the lasting weight of that first morning than any single raid could. They abandoned Lindisfarne for good. They took with them what mattered most, the coffin containing the body of St Cuthbert, along with other sacred relics, and left the island that had been their home for 2.5 centuries. What followed was not a short journey to safety. The monks carried Cuthbert's coffin across the region for 7 years, moving from place to place, before finally settling at Chester Street, where they remained for roughly a century. When danger threatened again, they moved once more, eventually settling in 995 at a defensible bend in a river, in a city that would grow up specifically around the shrine they carried with them, Durham. The magnificent cathedral that stands there today, and still holds what is believed to be St Cuthbert's tomb, exists because a community of monks spent more than a century refusing to let the raid on Lindisfarne be the end of what they had built, carrying their saints' relics from place to place until they found ground safe enough to finally set them down. What followed this raid was not an isolated tragedy that Northumbria simply recovered from and moved past. It was the opening note of a pattern that would recur across British coastlines for decades, occasional at first, then relentless, until within a century, entire kingdoms would face not raiding parties of 100 men, but armies with conquest, not plunder, as their goal. That story, the story of the great heathen army that would eventually bring 3 of England's 4 kingdoms to their knees, is one we've already told in full elsewhere on this channel. Lindisfarne is where that longer story begins, not with an army, but with 100 men, an undefended shoreline, and a monastery that had never once imagined it needed walls. So what actually happened on this island, stripped of the omens and the myths about who came first? A community devoted to prayer and scripture, built around the memory of one of Britain's most beloved saints, was struck by raiders it had no way to anticipate and no means to resist. The violence was real, though likely filtered through the grief and theology of the only people left to describe it. The panic it caused across Christian Europe was not really about the scale of what was stolen or even how many died. It was about what it meant that the sea, and the sacred both, had failed to protect anyone at all. Portland came first chronologically, but Lindisfarne is where an entire civilization's sense of safety actually broke, and it broke in a single, undefended morning, on an island that would flood back into isolation with the tide by evening, as if nothing at all had happened there. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the myths corrected, the sources weighed honestly, the moments where an ordinary morning became the hinge an entire age turned on, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us